Mr. President, as my time here in the Senate winds down, I find myself reflecting on many of the reasons why I decided to return to the U.S. Senate. And without a doubt, one of the main factors for my return was the skyrocketing federal debt and the harm that Washington's excessive spending will have on future generations, including my children and 10 grandchildren. The day President Obama took office, the national debt was $10.6 trillion. We're now closing in on $20 trillion. And clearly, this cannot be sustainable without extraordinarily negative consequences for the future. That debt clock continues to tick along, and we continue to roll into more and more debt as we spend more and more on government programs than the revenue coming in to pay for it. So when I returned to the Senate in 2011, I sought out opportunities to address this ticking time bomb and debt bomb. I worked with my colleagues, with Republicans, across the aisle with Democrats, on efforts to restrain federal spending and stabilize our nation's finances. There were a number of efforts made. We are all familiar with Simpson-Bowles, a bipartisan effort that tragically did not succeed and was not accepted by the president. The Committee of Six, the Gang of Six, so-called Gang of Six, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, seriously and astutiously working to try to put together a formula to put us on a path to fiscal responsibility. Then there was the Super Committee. There were outside groups led by both Republicans and Democrats. Ultimately, we finalized the effort, or hoped that we were finalizing the effort, when the president, through his own initiative, crossed the aisle here, brought several of us into his venue and talked about how we could work together. And I was part of that effort. Ultimately, 8 of us spending a considerable amount of time with the president's top people and the president himself to try to find a solution, or at least a step forward in the right direction. And I'm really sorry to say that that also did not succeed in the end, when even some of the president's own budget initiatives that he had proposed were rejected by him later as part of a package. So when it became clear to me that the major reform efforts could not be enacted while the administration occupied the White House, I launched a new initiative, which I called the Waste of the Week. I decided that each week in the Senate, when the Senate is in session, I would speak about documented and certified examples by nonpartisan agencies, those that we turn to give us the numbers, to those inspector generals that have investigated the situation and made recommendations, the Government Accountability Office, and all the material that is provided to us, not on a partisan basis, but simply the numbers, just the facts in terms of how taxpayers' money is being spent. Well, today marks the 55th and final Waste of the Week speech, and maybe fitting so on what looks to be the last day of this session and my last day serving in the United States Senate. It's a little bit of a walking down memory lane in terms of talking about the waste of the week and the various items that we have proposed. It's been everything from the serious to the ridiculous, which grabs people's attention and says, look, I can understand maybe this particular situation where we were overspent, but come on. Clearly, surely, we weren't using taxpayer dollars for something as ridiculous or embarrassing as that. Well, from everything, let me mention a few of my favorite examples here that we've talked about. Fraudulent double dipping in Social Security, disability insurance, and unemployment insurance benefits at the tune of $5.7 billion that was spent through basic fraud by those who were submitting and receiving applications for and receiving payments for both. Look, if you can work but are thrown out of work, unemployment insurance is available to you. If you're disabled and can't work, Social Security disablement payments are made to you. But you can't collect both. And people were collecting both to the tune of $5.7 billion. Fraud in the food stamp program. People were fraudulently receiving up to a total of $3 billion documented dollars in that program. The Department of Agriculture payments to dead people resulted in over $27 million of payments. And these are the things that were presented to this. And perhaps the thing that gathered the most attention, we were talking about several hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars. Something that grabbed the most attention was a study by the National Institute of Health, a grant which was issued, in which 18 New Zealand white rabbits received 4 30-minute massages a day. The study was conducted at Ohio State University and designed to figure out whether massages can help recovery times after strenuous exercise. Well, I raised the question as, did we need to bring over 18 white New Zealand rabbits? I don't know what the cost of that was. I think we probably could have found some rabbits in the United States at much less cost. But nevertheless, the study went forward, and guess what? The results were that after 4 massages a day, after strenuous exercise, they felt better than if they didn't get the massages. I wanted to apply for that process there, but I learned that they euthanized the rabbits after the study was done, so I thought, well, it's a good thing I didn't join that effort. But nevertheless, I kind of was thinking, couldn't you just ask the Ohio State football team after a practice, hey guys, we're going to divide you in 2 categories. This category over here is not going to get massages after our strenuous practice sessions, and this half is going to get the massages, and we'll see if the guys who get the massages feel better than the guys who didn't. I think that would have saved the taxpayer a considerable amount of money had we done that. I don't see why the National Institutes of Health can come to the conclusion that a grant request for massaging rabbits is a good use of taxpayer money. So, well, that's just 4 out of the 54 that I've talked about. That's my walk down memory lane. But the total amount of waste identified through these 54 examples adds up to more than $350 billion. We're down here arguing now about payments on a program, and we are talking about, well, we can't fund this, we can't fund that, that's an essential program, the Defense Department needs more money, the National Institutes of Health needs more money for cancer research, but we don't have any more money to give them. Why not take actions to stop this waste, fraud, and abuse? Or better yet, why not ask the taxpayer for this money in the first place? Why should the taxpayer be sending money to Washington to see that the accomplishment is waste, fraud, or abuse? Now, I'm pleased to note that we've actually had some success in addressing some of these wasteful spending highlighted in these speeches. Last year, the Congress approved legislation that will finally phase out the so-called temporary tax credit for wind energy, a credit that was supposed to expire over 20 years ago. We were promised that. This is a study to get it started and see if it works, to get enough wind energy at a cost that the public could afford, and see this as a way of providing alternative energy. But boy, once something's on the books, it gets reauthorized and reauthorized over and over, and for 20 years, it's, oh, we just need it one more year. We just need it one more time. And on it goes. And finally, we have seen action taken by the Congress to complete this phase-out program, which will essentially save taxpayers billions of dollars and reduce the government's involvement in picking winners and losers through tax policy. Congress also approved a measure I introduced to improve compliance and higher education tax benefits by simply adding language to require proof of eligibility for certain tuition tax credits. We saved taxpayers over $500 million in improper payments. And recent defense authorization bills have included provisions to reform the defense contracting process, which will help cut down on billions of waste. And of course, more work is still needed in this area. A recent report identified as much as $125 billion in wasteful spending at the Department of Defense. And I'm a strong proponent of a strong national defense. But when we find that well over $100 billion has been misspent, we're compromising our national security. And we're not giving our soldiers and sailors and Marines and Coast Guard and others, we're not giving them all the resources they need to provide for our national security the way it needs to be provided for. Well, today I'm here for my 55th and final Waste of the Week. I want to talk about relatively modest, it's amazing you can say this, only here in this chamber, only in Washington is $48 million called modest, because we talk in billions and trillions. But anyway, $48 million in Medicaid funding for drugs to treat hair loss. Not hair loss for therapeutic reasons, not hair loss as a result of cancer treatments, but for cosmetic purposes. Medicaid is paying out $48 million to provide for measures that will help reduce hair loss. I want to stress that Medicaid is part of our nation's safety net to help those in need. All the more reason why we have to ensure that Medicaid is run effectively and efficiently to have the financial resources to help low-income families gain access to medical care. But this also means we have to protect Medicaid by ensuring that its finances are not used for medically unnecessary services. Now, there are certain medical services that all state Medicaid plans are mandated to provide. And then there are a number of additional services that are optional for states to cover. But one of these services includes drugs to treat cosmetic hair loss. Now, this is not hair loss due to an underlying medical issue, as I mentioned. No, this is hair loss that, frankly, just happens, often as we age. And the treatments paid by Medicaid are for cosmetic purposes only. I think all of us would love to have a full head of hair. And I speak as one that falls in that category. And as I look around the Senate chamber, I see others that have joined me in watching the hair fall off their head and looking in the mirror and say, how many hairs did I lose last night, and when is this going to end? So losing your hair is not always fun, but I promise you, as someone who's been through all this, you're not alone. And soon enough, you will simply affect the fact that while you won't make the finals of the 50 most beautiful people in America, life will go on. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the federal government could save $48 million over 10 years by not paying for this cosmetic loss treatment. And while this may seem like a small amount of money compared to our nearly $20 trillion national debt, it is yet another example of unnecessary use of hard-earned taxpayer dollars. Fortunately, the Senate recently passed legislation that included a provision to end the federal reimbursement for cosmetic hair loss. And that bill, fortunately, is on the way to the President for signature into law. And so, by bringing attention to some of these issues, we've been able to take legislative action to try to address and keep this unnecessary spending off the charts. To conclude, let me say that I would like to, while today marks the end of the Waste of the Week, I want to implore my colleagues to, in the House and Senate, to keep going, to keep fighting, to stop wasteful spending. I also want to acknowledge that my staff, over the period of time, at different times as they were working on this project, provided to me the examples, and they dug in and did the research so that I could come to the floor to make these points and hopefully save the taxpayer hard-earned dollars that shouldn't have been sent to Washington in the first place, but were not used wisely and efficiently when they came here. Our former governor, my friend Mitch Daniels, former governor of Indiana, and the current president of Purdue University famously said that you'll be amazed by how much government you'll never miss. Indiana has set the example with significant cuts and reforms in spending to take our state from a deficit to a $2.4 billion surplus. There were significant cuts in many agencies through the growing of bureaucracy that took place, and we have yet to find what parts of government that we miss. There are so many programs and so many ridiculous things that the government funds, like rabbit massages, like cosmetic hair loss treatment, that most of Americans don't even know about and have never heard of. And while I no longer will be here, I am hopeful that the next president and the next Congress will work in tandem to achieve these goals. They can use my 55 Waste of the Week examples as a starting point. They can continue because we have just scratched the surface. So today, I'd like to add $48 million to our total. And just in this cycle of the Senate alone, we have come up with a grand total of $351,635,239,536, money that could be used for a better purpose. Mr. President, with that, and my final words addressed to my colleagues in this extraordinary experience that I've been privileged to enjoy, I, for the last time, yield the floor.